All right, welcome back to part 2 of the scientific method of inquiry. We're going to continue our exploration of the positivistic way of thinking. Positivistic continues to be the worst word in the world to pronounce. I can't even say one syllable words right now. But this is what we're looking at. And as a reminder, the positivistic way of thinking aligns very closely and is present within quantitative research methods. And so what really this way of thinking strives to do is reduce all uncertainty and really get as close to objectivity as possible, because that allows them to do some of these bullet points that we're going to discuss. And so when you're striving to be objective, one of the ways to accomplish that is to make sure any variable that you are measuring or looking at has some element of measurability. This way of thinking believes that in order for something to exist, it has to be able to be measured. And so some of like the abstract concepts of truth, thinking about psychology, the id and the ego, those are really difficult to put a quantifiable measurement on. And so it does pose the question, do they exist? But that's getting a little existential and not on topic. And so anything within quantitative and positivistic ways of thinking is really looking at measurability. And even then, if there are concepts that are harder to measure, like truthfulness, putting some sort of numeric label onto them would help then keep that quantifiable. So if you wanted to ask college students how important truthfulness is to them, you would want to put a word definition in a question saying, truthfulness is defined as X, Y, and Z. How important is this to you on a scale from 1 to 10? And so there is ways to kind of get around some of those abstract concepts in more of that numerical objective way. Then leads us into the second bullet point is we're really looking at total objectivity. Now, this one is really difficult sometimes to achieve completely within the social work research field. It kind of relates back to the crispy nugget of, because we're working with human subjects, it can be difficult because humans by nature are subjective. And so if you're thinking about, if you're doing some sort of observations of a behavior in a supervised setting, people perform differently when they know people are watching them. I have to be observed soon as part of my job requirements. And so I know that Professor Colin and the Dr. Detweiler, the dean of the academic dean, they're going to come and they're going to observe a class. I can guarantee you that I will probably dress a little bit differently than I usually do. I might not be wearing jeans. I might be wearing a skirt. I might have more group activities, make everything look bright and shiny. So that's not necessarily always the most objective way of observing my teaching, because I know that I'm being observed. I tend to behave differently. I think that's kind of standard for everybody, even if it's not like intended to be manipulative or ill-intended. It does impact objectivity in some shape or form. If you're also looking at, like if you are observing parenting time and you and a colleague are looking to see how many times a mother says a harmful statement to their child, well, you and your colleague might have different interpretations of what a harmful statement might be. And so you might be like, oh, that was harmful. And they're like, oh, no, that was so encouraging. And so again, there's some subjectivity that does come into these studies. You have to be very mindful of trying to eliminate as many of those as possible if you are doing a quantitative study. One of the big pieces of quantitative studies in the positivistic way of thinking is trying to create some sort of research study and outcome that can be duplicated onto other individuals who are in a similar situation. So let's say, because for all three of your research groups, you're focusing on college-age students. So if we had more time, it would be great to be able to like implement some sort of like intervention of thinking about mental health. And so being able to bring, let's say, puppies into a classroom for a class, does that help reduce the mental wellness of students? And so our goal would then be to create it in such a way that if it did show that, yes, that improved the mental well-being by being able to take puppies into college classes, that we could publish those studies and then have other universities and colleges duplicate our intervention because it was proven to be effective. And so how you set up your quantitative study is done in a way to reduce some of those biases or those anomalies that might skew the research, in order to be able to say, yes, you can actually take this to any university and college and have it be as effective as it was in the context of Kuiper College. That's one of the big goals. And that marries right along to the standardized procedures. That's why we teach you the scientific methods, because they are the standardized procedures. They're proven to be effective. They are eliminating the risk of harm to human participants. And so again, it's going back to that very objective, universal standards and mentality, looking at the variables so it can be generalized to other populations. So in summary, positivistic thinking tries to study only things that can be objectively measured, and so being able to attach some sort of numerical value to it. Researchers attempt to do studies in such a way that they can be duplicated to others using well-accepted standardized procedures. That is a beautiful summary of these 4 bullet points. All right, so moving along, the quantitative approach has 7 different steps involved with it. And so I have 2 different graphics showing different ways. This is kind of a narrative way, and the next slide shows it more in a visual way. We are not going to go over these in depth today because we're going to flesh those out in class on Monday. But really, step 1 starts with a problem areas chosen. You create a question or hypothesis. You identify the variables within the research question, making sure you know exactly what you're looking at. So if you're thinking about college age, does that mean individuals over the age of 18? Is there a certain ethnicity? Is there a certain gender you're looking at? Those are all different variables. I know with the physical health group, you guys had thrown out looking at college athletes as part of a specific focus. And so those are all variables you would have to identify as part of a quantitative, because an athlete might have different physical wellness habits versus a individual who's not a college athlete. And so those are going to be variables that might impact the results. Step 3 is making a plan and implementing 4 through 7. Step 4 is where you collect the data for all those variables that you identified. You analyze the data. You come to a conclusion, make interpretations based on the data, and then you write the report with the findings and recommendations. Within here, with numbers 5 and 6, you will want to have a conversation about the limitations that you might have experienced in collecting the data. So being honest that there may have been some variables that might have been skewed or didn't take into consideration, or unintentional things that went wrong. That's all part of the process, which we will talk about. But that's like the down and dirty quantitative approach in 7 steps. As you can see, it is starting at problem 1. It is a cycle. You go through these steps linearly or sequentially. There's not bopping back and forth, but this is what it looks like with the quantitative positivistic research approach. All right, qualitative. This is where you use data collection and analysis first to discover what the most important questions are, and then you refine and answer questions that are increasingly more specific. So this often tends to be kind of that exploratory piece. You're not necessarily, it can be used to explain things, but qualitative can help explore kind of what is actually going on with your population or the topic that you are researching. So this is aligned with the interpretive way of thinking. So qualitative approach to knowledge development is embedded within the interpretive way of thinking about viewing the world. So these are things that are present in this way of thinking. Is you want to acknowledge that there's constantly changing realities within your research study. And so there's 3 different realities that can constantly be changing. It's the researcher's reality. You might come into your research study with a preconceived notion of what you are going to find, or you might have a really strong bias towards one just because you don't have all the information. And then you might meet someone in your study who completely changes your perspective on things. So then your reality has changed and your approach to the data and questioning might look a lot different. Your participants' reality is constantly changing as well, based on maybe how much they like or don't like you. Maybe they're having a good day or bad day. Maybe something like if you're working with a group of mothers who are having difficulties with attachment with your children. Well, if the attachment improves during the duration of the research study, their perceptions of how things are going might change differently based on circumstances that they're actively living. And that kind of then ties into the mutual reality between the researcher and the participant. If you guys get along really well, you might then have more positive regard to the questioning. If the researcher does something to impact the participant, they might be more resistant to answering the questions. The research study you might be reaching barriers. You're not able to get your participants the resources that they need, or the intervention didn't go as planned. There might be a snow day. All of these different factors might kind of impact that working relationship. And so you have to be aware that that is going to impact the realities of everybody, and that it might then impact the data and the reports that you're getting from your participant. Another element is gathering words from active research participants around their experiences. And so the textbook had a really good example kind of differentiating between how in qualitative studies the participants are more active, and in quantitative they're more passive. And this is how they explained it is, let's say a hospital was doing some research on the frequency of C-sections versus natural or versus vaginal births. And they're looking to see, like, is this occurring more frequently than it needs to be? And so if they're collecting quantitative data, they might have 20 moms that had a C-section in the month of February, and they list them as mom 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. And they then look at the data based on, mother number 19 identified that she had a C-section, but it was an emergency section after she had failed or had not been able to have a vaginal birth after X amount of hours. Research participant number 5 identified they had a C-section as their primary choice and method of delivery. And so there's not much engagement and active role around it. It kind of makes them more in just to a test subject versus a human being. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because you are, again, producing really good quality data from it, but it does give a different vibe and feel. Now with an interpretive, you're asking those questions, you're engaging, you're exploring, you're desiring to know what birth mom was thinking. Like, why did she choose C-section? Was it because she had past C-sections and that's what her doctor was recommending? Was she really passionate about this method of birth? Or was she resigned into thinking that it was the only way because that's what happened before? I don't know. But that kind of creates them more active and engaged in their research. And it thoroughly explores values so the interactions with their research participants may be more completely and honestly understood. And so within interpretive, you are allowed to acknowledge that you do have a bias and how that might impact your interactions. So crispy nugget number 2 in relation to more of the interpretive way of thinking is, to quantitative research, value awareness means you're putting your values aside, but for qualitative researchers, it just means that you're immersing in your values, so their inevitable effect is understood. You are going to experience some feelings by having conversations with your research participants, and you have to be aware of how those are going to play out and either are celebrated or are harmful within the research process. The qualitative approach looks more at phases, and I'm going to switch to this one because you're going to see phase 1 and phase 2 kind of are sequential, but once you're in phase 3, they kind of flow all differently based on the conversations and the data that you are collecting. So some commonalities that are present in qualitative research is that they're conducted in natural settings. So you're wanting to get meeting people where they're at. You do not want to do any sort of control or manipulation of variables. You just want to let the research participants engage however they are at. You might not have all the questions at the onset. There might be more being developed as you get more information. Data collected is heavily influenced by research participants' experiences, and you want to validate that their experiences are valid to them. And meaning is drawn from the data using more natural and familiar processes versus statistical analysis. Usually it's like through conversations and then looking at the data from that. All right. I'm going to end this there.